I'm just going to do a quick intro again for the recording's sake. We've got Angelo Mandato here from the Columbus user group, and he's presenting your startup on AWS, how to architect and maintain a mean and lean account. So Angelo, take it away.
Yeah, so hi everybody. So what I wanted to talk about is how your startup on AWS can be architected in order to save money. So let's talk about that a little bit. When you're in a startup, money is very hard to come by. You really have to think twice about where you're spending your money, and we don't have the ability to just burn it like a large company like Apple, for example. They can just make advertisements and then take them down a day later, and they don't bother. But a startup, you can't spend money like that. You have to spend it wisely. So what I'm about to talk about is how to create a environment in AWS, first a sandbox or dev environment that costs $20 a month or less. And then a second one is a production environment for $100 a month or less. And this is before credits. And near the end, we'll talk about opportunities where if you're a startup, you can get credits as well to help get started using AWS. So the plan today is we're first going to talk about creating a cost culture. And what I mean by that is your workforce, your employees, or your contractors, making them feel comfortable and encouraged to come up with cost-saving opportunities, cost-saving architecture, to be self-conscious about the costs involved in everything that they architect. The second is we're going to talk about how to architect with cost savings in mind. And then the third is how to identify cost savings once you've launched. So a little bit about myself. Hi, I'm Angelo. I'm an entrepreneur. Right now I'm doing a startup called Painless Analytics. I've also done a startup with my wife. It's an Airbnb business that we've been doing for 4 years now, and we've been super hosts. And then my last major startup was Blueberry Podcasting. That's a podcast hosting and statistics service that we started in 2005. A bit more about my architecture background. I have a bachelor's of science from Kent State. Go Flashers, Flashes, sorry. I've done business, professional software development since 2000. I'm a certified Scrum product owner. My first encounter with AWS was in 2007. By 2009, I was pretty much using that exclusively for production workloads. And then also run, as Kathy mentioned, the user group here in Columbus, Ohio. So let's talk about culture. When we talk about our culture in our company, a lot of people think, hey, that means we have pizza parties, things like that. And what I think about a culture too, I try to incorporate the concepts of cost savings, at least with architecture and how things are designed. One of the most important things is that you're transparent with everybody. And when I mean transparent, everybody that is involved with dev architecture can see the bill. Everybody should be able to see Cost Explorer budgets, have access to the bill so they know what everything is costing. And this kind of creates an opportunity as well. Some people on your team will see that and know, hey, there's opportunities of things that I touch that could be changed to save money. Um, Another thing you can do is create a meeting cadence. For example, every month or once every 2 weeks, just meet for a certain amount of time with the team and talk about costs and talk about where there's opportunities to save money. Also want to involve stakeholders, not necessarily customers, but people higher in the business, leadership, for example, marketing, anybody that might have an influence on the cost savings opportunities, because there might be an opportunity where you come up with an idea how to get rid of an out of scan group, but one of the marketing reps says we can't do that. We're now advertising that as high available. So you need to have those kind of open conversations with everybody involved. And then also create a culture where there's feedback. Feedback is welcome. Um, and one of those parts is to really make sure that you're not, I guess the right word, mean or when someone says, "Hey, I accidentally left instance on for 2 weeks and I forgot to turn it off." You just have to be ready to say, "Well, bummer. I'm so glad that you gave us this feedback. That way we're able to save money from this point on." So another thing to do that you can do in your company is create incentive programs or incentive tasks or items. For example, you can come up with a reward system. You can recognize people that may have saved you money in your company. And then Kathy knows that we work with Dave that runs uh, the Milwaukee user group. He was talking about a lot of the savings he's done. Like he deserves more than a pat on the back on the amount of savings he's done at his company. So that's the kind of stuff that you want to do. You can come up with awards, bonuses. I personally don't like to reward individuals. I like to do groups or teams, but that's just my style. And then another thing which is actually a big motivator for a lot of folks like ourselves is the environment. It's no brainer that if you can cut the amount of resources you're using from, say, 50 instances to 25, that you're immediately helping the environment and preventing like half of your workload from using the amount of electricity that you were using previously. Another thing to do is create a culture of self-awareness. And I don't mean to get too much into that, but it kind of falls in with the um, being aware that people are going to make mistakes and be ready to accept them and give positive feedback for those kind of things. Also, but create a culture of communicating. Um, for example, there's going to be opportunities where a staff might come up with an idea, but if they're not comfortable in your environment to throw out their ideas on saving money, then you're never going to hear about them. So if you create that kind of culture where you encourage people to speak their mind, throw out ideas and appreciate those ideas, even if you don't use them, that you'll be able to eventually use that to your advantage because you will get a lot of great ideas over time. And then this also helps encourage innovative thinking because there might be 10 ideas that come out, but one will be so innovative, it could lead back, which I'll touch on later, into innovating the business itself. And believe it or not, just being self-aware, having good communication with everybody is more productive. You're going to have a lot less of the opportunities where people didn't know what to do, so they just didn't do anything, or they weren't involved in any of the decision making, so they didn't know what steps to do next. When you create a self-aware culture and everybody is involved, believe it or not, it's more productive. So, does anybody know why I put a picture of sliced bread up here? And actually, I'm going to look and see if there's any messages in the chat here. And Kathy, I don't know if people muted, so maybe I shouldn't ask the
So
question.
people can unmute themselves as
Oh,
moments.
okay.
So, yeah, go
Okay.
ahead and shout it out, guys.
Well, it's okay to be shy, I guess. But your idea is the next great thing since sliced bread. So when you think of that, that's how you need to think about things when you're architecting your software. So when we start architecting, we don't want to overthink the costs. First, we want to focus on innovating whatever it is we're trying to do. We want to get that new thing since sliced bread put together, and we want to get it launched right away. So once we do that, though, we can start thinking about all the things that we're architecting. For example, if we have sign-ons and we first use Cognito because it lets us get the sign-in piece integrated within a half a day, that's fine. But we can write a note in our Jira or whatever tool you're using to manage your backlog and say, if we switch this to another service, we could probably cut our costs down by a tenth. So, or am I saying that right? By 90%? That sounds better. Um, so we will track as we architect and get our first version up online. all these opportunities to save money, but we will not worry about architect or building those until later.
Hey, Angelo.
Yes.
I wanted to throw something out. You know what this makes me think of is the big Amazon Prime streaming brouhaha.
Oh yeah.
Or like, oh God, I think they started on serverless and then they switched it and saved a whole bunch of money. And what I think people missed in that story is that was the right thing to do, right? It was POC, get it up and running fast, and then optimize.
Yeah, exactly. Now they probably immediately did some short-term cost cutting that they could do with serverless, and then they went back and revisited the architecture once they had something that was popular. Because as an innovator, you got to think we're going to try 10 or 15 different things over the course of a couple of years. Um, if you do 15 different ideas, probably 14 of them aren't going to live past a year. So you don't want to spend a lot of time making the architecture the most lean and mean ever until you found that it's actually a product that a lot of people like. But we're going to talk about that how next, how you can architect without worrying about making these changes later being a heavy impact. So now that we're talked about how we're going to architect, which we're not going to worry about saving money, when do we start to save money? Immediately after we launch and the innovation is starting to uh, become popular, like the streaming service. So the question is, how do we architect though? So we create an infrastructure that we can easily take pieces, parts, and make them more efficient later. Well, I'm sure you've heard it a million times before from Amazon, but it is by creating a decoupled architecture. Um, when you create infrastructure where everything is a puzzle piece rather than one big monolith, then you can easily replace one piece of that puzzle without it impacting the rest. There might be a couple things that you need to do during those kind of rollouts, and it does sometimes look from the get-go that it's going to cost more time. But I'm here to tell you that the time involved is usually maybe another week of thinking how to lay everything out than it is actually development time. And actually, I would say that you can develop and release features faster with a decoupled architecture. And the tools that we will get there are with using templating, whether that's CloudFormation or Terraform. It's using serverless services as much as possible. Like Kathy was saying about they first developed using serverless. And that has a few advantages in that we can always take pieces parts, for example, not the whole thing from serverless back to a traditional or back to the containers. We can leave what works and is efficient once we wrote it for serverless, and then things that need more efficiency, we can pull out and rewrite in a different way. And we're going to try to share resources whenever possible. And when I say share, I'm talking about not over architecting things like your virtual private network. It's completely okay to put servers that might do two different things that are supposed to be in your public VPC in the same VPC, even if they don't communicate with each other. You can still create a single VPC and have a lot of these different applications in the same VPC, then create multiple VPCs, for example. There's a lot more to that too. The database, for example, I see a lot of companies literally create a separate database, and I don't mean database as in um, the name of the database, for example, with um, MySQL or MySQL, but I mean the actual server. It's completely possible if you share the same VPC that you can have separate applications such as a wiki and a blog, and they still use the same physical database, RDS database, but they have separate databases on the same machine. Those are examples of where you can share resources and you're still getting the same amount of performance out of them. And obviously using low-cost rapid development frameworks as well. And I personally use Laravel, but there's a lot out there for .NET, for Java, Node, Python, you name it. there is templating code ready out there for you to quickly deploy an application. So again, we talked a little bit of, does this slow down dev? The decoupled architecture will actually help you figure out how you're going to scale. You'll be able to identify pieces that you need to put in high availability zones or make high available. And it'll also, in the process of creating your decoupled architecture and the templating for creating that infrastructure, you're inadvertently creating your disaster recovery plan as well. When you do all this, you're identifying your items that are really critical to your service level agreement, things that cannot go down. And believe it or not, you will innovate faster. And again, some people will say a monolith app, it's easier, but when this starts to make sense is when you have one contractor working on one piece of your application and another team working on another, and they can start releasing independently. When you're at that point, you are definitely innovating faster. You're able to have separate teams working at different cadences, but still get things out. So here's an opportunity now for people to ask questions, because this is the right moment to ask some questions. So what do we have, Cleveland? Let's see. No one is unmuting. Are there any comments, maybe?
Yeah, everybody feel free to unmute yourself. We've got a small group here, so.
Hi, hi, this is Mark. I fully agree that you build something first, you get it out into the market and then or into test and you upgrade it or update it as you see, as time progresses. I do that. Everything I do. Let me ask you, this isn't relevant to startups. I'm sorry. You can hear me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
um, I have I have an account in an enterprise environment, and it's a billing issue. I had for like 3 months, I had storage that I had deprecated the RDS, but I still had this backup in storage. And maybe it's just a story, but I was getting billed, or my organization was getting billed for a penny a month, and for like 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, accounting was livid with me because I couldn't resolve, that little issue for them. Cutting a check for a penny, it's a dollar to cut a check, right? I mean, you know what I mean. So I just bring that up. It'd be nice if there was a way you could say, don't bill me until it's a minimum of, $5 or something like that. You know what I mean? So, anyways, thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it sounds like you need to get a gift card with some credit on it. So that for that little, yeah,
Donuts, right?
yeah.
For the payment, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Some AWS credit gift card.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think you were going to talk about credits, Angela. So that I was good. Hope you don't mind. Tusme, you're FinOps. So do you have any thoughts on that? Is there some sort of minimum threshold that could be set up?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. I'm part of the team that manages the cloud spend for our organization. So we're typically dealing with significantly higher amounts, but the principles are the same. And one thing I wanted to add, Angelo, is your comment about, like, cost is never going to be the number one non-functional requirement, right? There's going to be the thing you need to build. It needs to work right. It needs to be performant. You probably want it to scale linearly. You want it to be secure. Cost is important, but trying to get teams to put that in the top three can be difficult. So, and also the speed at which we need to innovate these days is just, it's not decreasing, it's increasing. So I like that you put in there that, yeah, you should always be thinking about cost, have it in mind. But as much as I would love for cost to be a number one citizen and part of the architecture discussion, it should be there. But the idea of iterating, releasing something and going back and optimizing it is a good approach, because just being realistic, some of the other non-functional requirements just tend to trend higher in terms of importance. In terms of the billing, I hadn't thought about the option you mentioned there, Angelo. Like if you just had some sort of credit on file rather than the money for cutting a check. I mean, and probably many of us work as part of shared organizations where we have costs, and there's always going to be little bits and pieces that get left behind, whether it's a little secrets manager secret or the RDS backup that Mark, that you mentioned, or something. Like, it's just our cleanup routines don't always function that way. So it's unfortunate that somebody in accounting is upset about having to write a check for a penny, but there are larger problems in the world for sure, in other organizations in terms of dollar amounts, you know. So that's my thoughts there.
For sure. Good stuff, Tusme. Angelo 2 has a question or comment for Angelo 1.
It's so weird to be in another meeting with another Angelo. It's very odd. Angelo, I don't know if you're having this too. Every time someone refers to you, I'm like, what? Can you give more examples of decoupling, please? And just for reference, I'm primarily developing on Python using Flask, Lambda, RDS. That's primarily kind of my flow. And I do think when I'm developing a lot about design debt, like how is this going to bite me hard, months from now? So can you give a couple more examples about like what decoupling might look like in the type of environment that I'm working in?
Yeah. So do you mind kind of mentioning what your application does, or is that top secret?
It's not top secret. I do a lot of geospatial, and on the front end, I'm allowing users to basically change records, add records. And like, for example, you mentioned incognito. I know what it is. I don't use it because it just seemed too much to manage. So I'm using just like Flask OAuth, and I feel like that's one piece of design debt there. But can you say like what decoupling is? Do you mean like decoupling within the AWS environment or decoupling from service providers? Like what? I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah.
I don't know if that adds any
No.
more.
Yeah, this is awesome because that's a segue into the next topic here. If you guys are ready, I'll dig into it.
Good.
All right. So, oh, did I just show the same? Oh, let me finish these slides and then we'll get right into my example. I'm going to actually talk about how I architected my business, my startup, the Painless Analytics, and also Blueberry Podcasting. There's lots of opportunities basically to split out services to be separate and communicate with each other, for example. So just thinking about the decoupled architecture, you're able to separate the complexity, you're able to focus on innovation, your flexibility, scalability, and maintainability is now separated, and you can have independent development happening at the same time. So when we architect with costs in mind, we're trying to use low-cost resources whenever possible. We're eliminating idle resources. We're combining resources when possible. And we're also architecting the lower environments to run on absolute minimum. And I can go into a really good example why you want to do that as well in a little bit. And also, you're trading a little bit of dev time for efficiency. So that is a bit of a balancing act. So let's get into this example, which you were kind of asking about. And that's how I have Painless Analytics architected. So I have three core silos for lack of a better explanation. I have the service itself, and that's separated into 4 separate projects, plus obviously a database. Actually, there's 2. There's some MySQL stuff going on, as well as DynamoDB. That is a processor which does the actual processing, creates the analytics for people. The account is a project that, similar to the path that you took, I'm using Laravel to handle authentication. And you're right, there is a little bit of extra tech debt where if we just used Cognito, we could have saved a little bit of time. But if you start thinking about integrated features, sign-ins, things like that, you really do want to have your authentication piece separate. A good example is if you're a SaaS and you plan on also supporting people being able to sign in with their Google account, for example, or their Apple ID. The cost at Cognito is cheap at first, but at 10 cents a user a month per federated login, if you plan on having 50,000 users, all of a sudden that becomes, and that's going to become a line item in your bill. So obviously when we made our first version, I used Cognito just to get it going, but immediately we replaced it with this account project. And it also let us create a central dashboard for people when they signed in. And then from there, the dashboard project itself is literally a React front end only, not using the newer version of React with the combination of front end, back end, just the more classic version of React as far as client only. And then behind that, I have an API project that powers the dashboard. And that is also a separate project. So when you're looking at like GitHub, for example, these are separate applications. The logging silo, there's two projects there. The logger itself, and that's actually how that's the secret sauce of the company. That's how we're gathering all the data that gets tracked on a website, and we're getting it ready to send to the processor service or application. We do a lot of like we got rid of a lot of the ETL process, and we're doing a lot of the conversion at the time we're logging data, and we're also doing it in an efficient way. And then the tracker is the actual JavaScript itself. We could have easily architected both of these things on the same project, but what this allows us to do is every time there's a change that we want to do for how we're tracking in the JavaScript, that part of the application, we can release that independent of how the data is logged. And then this is the other piece here, the dev ops and dev environment. I kind of lump these together. And when I go into a little bit more detail why, I think that'll be an eye opener for a lot of people, both on cost and onboarding a new employee. So for example, the dev env project, all that is a GitHub project that when I hire someone new or a contractor, they follow about 8 or 9 steps where they pull that project only into their local environment. And then I have them go into a special bin folder in the project and run either bash or bat files, depending on which kind of computer they're using. And it continues to pull down all these other projects, as well as a development version of the database and a version of DynamoDB that can be run locally without using even Docker. All that in that dev environment project ties in then with the DevOps project, which has a lot of cloud formations and scripts in order to create the infrastructure, both in the dev environment and production environment. And then there's a lot of opportunity for different servers and applications to share resources, and that goes into the service shared repo, for example. And if you're curious, the different kind of applications I have mixed around is Node.js, mainly for Lambda functions, but we also do some other stuff with that. We're using Laravel on EC2 instances, and MySQL and DynamoDB for various tasks. And then there's also some freshly built things like our logger project. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned like having separate repos for these, I think you were saying project a lot, and it wasn't clicking that you're potentially setting these up through repos. So that's a helpful tip. Thanks.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, thinking about how this then looks in production and in your dev environment, I actually have a couple other environments. I have a beta environment, but there's nothing in it now. Every once in a while, I'll load it all up if we wanted to do some beta testing, or that would be your QA testing if that has to be done, or yeah, UAT testing, user acceptance testing. Then the DevOps account is the same deal. It barely gets used now that we have everything architected, but if we decide to start doing something with architecture, we'll go through, we'll run all the DevOps scripts, which take about a half hour. And then all the infrastructure is in that account. Then we do whatever changes. When we're done, we clean that account back down, and then it's empty again. And what I've seen in a lot of larger companies is they just kind of leave a DevOps architecture account running all the time with everything and just wasting money. Or worse, they use the same account for dev that they do for DevOps. And that's really painful, especially if they're trying to respin up infrastructure while developers are trying to test at the same time. It is a disaster. So Also, with sharing resources, in my dev account, we have only one EC2 instance, even though when we're in production, we might have a dozen and they're doing different things for high availability reasons. PHP, Node, applications like that, if they're not running serverless, they can all be run on the same box in our situation, which really allows for the same experience when they're developing locally. And the advantage there is that they're not having to have a lot of heavy things running on your computer, like Docker. Although if you have a really nice Apple lately, you can run Docker, and it seems like it doesn't flinch anymore. But it just makes it easier for dev, and it also makes it easier in the test environment or for your development. But you're giving up high availability in your dev environment. I think that's a small price to pay, and I'd rather the dev environment be similar to the local environment that the developers are developing in than worry about scaling. And when we have those conversations, when we are dealing with scaling, things like that, it really needs to be a conversation interacting with DevOps, and that's where that part is tested, is in the DevOps account, which again, we leave off or leave clean until we need to test something. And then production, that's where things are crazy and cost a lot more. We have an auto scaling group. We have some EC2 instances set up in an auto scaling group, an application load balancer that feeds into that. We have the RDS database set up in high availability mode. We're still sharing resources, so there might be 5 different databases on that RDS server itself, but we know and we have a plan because we did keep everything decoupled. If we run into a situation where one of those applications needs to scale out, we can easily copy that RDS and start creating separate instances, even move them to separate VPCs if that ever became necessary for scaling. And we use serverless whenever possible, especially in situations where we're offering a service level agreement. And then, believe it or not, the same one instance setup in dev we use for just a couple things in production for non-critical things like the blog. We can live with the blog being down for 5 minutes. And we still set up a auto scaling group of 1 that will replace that instance if something were to happen to it. So we're not literally high available, but it's also not going to be down for long either. So sometimes there's questions at that one too. So feel free to cut in and ask if there's a question about that.
I don't have a question, Angelo, but I really like that thought about, like so often it's easy to hear like, oh, this thing has 11 nines. Of course I want that. But your point, I think teasing it apart of like, this thing could go down for a little bit. This thing is mission critical. Like looking at the pieces parts, like that resonated with me.
Oh yeah, and not everything has to be high available. If you go back to how things were just 15 years ago, before we really could do a lot of stuff on AWS, well, 20 years ago now. I mean, this was how we did it. Usually it was like one instance that ran the blog, and we had to do daily backups, and we had scripts and procedures that we had to follow in order to restore it if the server went down. Now it's, we have infrastructure as code that allows us to automate a lot of this stuff to be replaced instantly. So even though it's not high available, it's still highly resilient, I think is the right way of saying. So I wanted to put my money where my mouth is, for example, and show my bills. So for my dev bill 2 months ago, it's less than $20 a month. Now, unfortunately, in May, I accidentally left 2 volumes after we pulled in and out an auto scaling group, and our bill went up. But I'm happy to say the bill is back down to about $85, $90 a month. It's just, this is the reality of what's going to happen, and you need to have that good example of self-awareness. Even the owner screws up. So I did talk about the local dev environment, and I will just dive in just a little deeper in case you guys are curious. When a developer checks out that dev env project, it runs some scripts that will help install WAMP server on Windows, or you first have to install Apache, PHP, and MySQL otherwise on your Mac or Linux. And then we run in the script config files to basically set up Apache running locally, just like how you would set up CloudFront with different origins to go to different IP address or ports, I should say, with the same local IP address for running your Node application with Express, or running your React application on port 3000, or just connecting to your database, or running DynamoDB from command line, running it locally. The advantage here is that your developers can literally run everything locally. They can set it up, and you're really able to save some time. And I don't know, other folks here have this situation, but it seems like every company I've done contract work with, the documentation is all over the place, and it takes me about a week or longer to just set up everything. And really, it's the same amount of effort of doing it once to document and create scripts to do this in an automated way. This is like development DevOps, really. And it should be a culture, and I just don't see it. So I'm hoping, if anything, some people here take that and just start spreading. So let's talk about some tips that I have. It's very important to document everything, create company policies and run books. That way you keep consistency. You want to separate what is core to your business versus secondary. For example, the blog, that's secondary. You shouldn't even be focusing a lot on that. And in some cases, it might make more sense to, instead of hosting the blog yourself, is use a service and put it on a subdomain and leave it at that. You want to make incremental releases and detailed dated change logs. I'm a big proponent of creating a change log in the Markdown format, and there's an actual website that talks about create a change log. It's a really good format. It also helps you kind of keep a good rules for your developers to follow, as far as making version numbers with 2 dots, 3 zeros, 3 digits with 2 dots in between, so it's consistent. You want to review infrastructure cost on a cadence, like once a month or once quarterly, and then only implement high availability when necessary. It doesn't need to be with every single application you roll out, unless it's literally tied to your service level agreement. Okay, here's another good opportunity for questions before I segue into the next section here.
Hey, Angelo, I
Yeah.
know this is like a basic, but can you talk a little bit about billing alerts? I feel like it's just one of those things that gets lost sometimes. Like you talked about, leaving an instance running, or, even in your case, right? Like your bill went up pretty substantially, as a percentage. And I just feel like it's one of those steps that gets missed a lot.
Yeah, and actually we talked about this at community day, and I forgot to add the slide. Let me write that down. But basically with CloudWatch, you can actually monitor the price differences happening, and send yourself email or other types of alerts when the bill, or even more detailed, a tag, which might be a specific application, exceeds a certain amount, for example. So hopefully I'm hitting that right. Oh, there's a hand.
Yeah, thanks, Angelo. I was just going to add, you mentioned CloudWatch can detect some things. Some of the cloud providers, especially AWS, also have native tools just to tell you if my average cost goes up more than 10%, just send me an alert, or by a dollar amount. So, and then it just goes to an email address. So you don't have to worry about, I mean, sometimes AWS wants like an SNS notification and this and all that. Like, it's just like, if this condition is met, send an email to this place. So really simple. As long as you have access to the sort of cost explorer and billing interface.
Right, and that ties back into, I suggest everybody have access to that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Another question?
Yes. So that's very good presentation so far. So I started using AWS a couple of months back, and I'm really impressed that you have your costs like way below $200 a month. I mean, I'm still learning and discovering a lot of things, but I was recently introduced to CloudWatch for setting alarms and getting SNS notifications and things like that. But I still struggle with the fact that when I use RDS, I get a lot of like the bulk of my costs is like in the RDS servers. But I just realized when you say certain things don't necessarily have to be highly available, which means you can, trade off. You don't have to keep all these things running all the times. A couple of months, I also realized I had a lot of instances that were just running, auto scaling, just doing this whole work. And so, yeah, I'm just, getting my feet around. But my question is it really possible to have like, let's say a large organization and still expect to keep your bills below, let's say 200? Is it possible?
Oh, yeah. And so this bill is based off of a startup, but it would depend on the business. So a good example is the amount of users my company's able to handle right now is about 10,000. So when I finally reach a certain critical mass with customers, it's going to have to scale up. The bill's not going to be this low anymore.
Okay. Okay.
But and actually, it'll be linear with hopefully paying customers.
Angelo, if I
Okay.
could chime in here too, depending on your size, I mean, heck, even if you are super small, AWS has credits all over the place, and particularly if you're with the startup team, ask those reps if you could get some credits. Angelo, I'm sure you kind of mentioned credits earlier, if you have any advice on, how to secure those.
Yeah, so I got my surprise slide at the end. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. Nice. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, so just thinking about here, this next phase is your business is now launched. You're starting to get vitality. You're getting lots of users. Now we're at that point where you guys are thinking, what happens when we start launching and we need to start thinking about cost savings? So just to rehash, we talked about we just need to get it launched right away first. We're going to create a culture where we're going to start recording all these different cost savings. And then when we architect, we're going to architect in a way that gives us lots of cost savings opportunities. So now it's time to identify these cost savings. So this is where my product owner hat comes on. And actually, I wish I had another hat I could switch to. But it's time to start thinking about the tasks. So when we start getting all these different ideas where we can save money, there's really going to be 4 types. And I'm sure you guys have seen those quadrants of how you determine what you should be working on, what you shouldn't. And it's pretty much the same thing. We want to quickly hit the items that are really small changes that we can make that can save a lot of money. And then we want to start looking at our backlog of tasks where it's going to require a lot of effort, but the savings again is going to be big. These last 2, where there's small changes we can make with small savings, we're not going to worry about it. If we touch code or touch something where that change could be made at the same time we're doing something else, maybe we'll pick that task up. But this last one, something is going to take a significant amount of work to get a very small amount of savings. We're never going to do that. You just have to, look at that particular task idea and say, hey, it's a good idea, but it's not worth it. And once you have that kind of mindset, you'll quickly see there's different things you can do right away to start bringing your bill down. So it's good to think about these cost savings in really 2 different approaches. One is the actual application itself. That's the code, your source code. The other is the architecture. We've talked about that a little bit, and we'll get more into it too. So I want to talk about an example at the Blueberry podcasting startup I was at, and that was the feed pulling system. And actually, Kathy, believe it or not, Lena was a developer that did this. So
That's cool.
yeah. So it was when her first month with us, she optimized our feed pulling service. But basically what was happening was our script was linear. It was not smart at all. It would just loop through the database directory, and pull a feed, update it, then pull the next one. So what she did was created a queue system, optimized how we were hitting the the URLs for the podcast feeds, and then further optimizing what headers we would send so headers wouldn't come back. Before you knew it, we quickly got to 50, 60,000 feeds an hour, and then 100. And then later on in more recent years, we were able to increase that up to 200,000 just by putting it on a server that had faster internet, a network bandwidth, which those are different classes of servers. If you ever wondered why they give you the bandwidth, this is one reason right here. And then this also led to innovation, a new feature. So believe it or not, we were able to monitor the feeds. We were seeing how often different feeds had literal XML errors in them, and it led to us building a service to validate the podcast feeds and monitor them for that matter. So we talked about here what you can do with software. Now let's talk about architecture. And I'm only going to touch on this. And at the end of my slides here, I'll have a link where you can go to my personal site. And I'm working on a page that will be linked on there soon, which goes into more details of all these different services where you can save money. But basically, Route 53, for example, and this one is surprising for a lot of folks. If you're using CNAME records for routing traffic to things such as CloudFront and ELB, things like that, you are basically throwing money out the window. Believe it or not, if you use what Amazon calls alias records, when you route traffic to your CloudFront distribution, or you route your CloudFront distribution to an auto-scaling group, every time it has to do that lookup, you're charged in Route 53. So when you get to the point where you have millions of users or even hundreds of thousands, your Route 53 bill is going to start creeping up. If you just change these to what they call alias records, they are free. There's no cost at all in Route 53. S3, for example, most companies already know this, most developers, but you want to put the S3 buckets in the same region where you're actually working in, where your application is running in. That way you don't have extra costs of going over the network. There's also storage classifications. There's, I forget the technical name, but there's a way now to set it on auto. So it basically will pick the best storage class, and people still don't do that. So there's opportunities there to save money on how much you're paying for the storage. Parameter store secrets is another one. I heard it mentioned earlier. I did a contract work last year for a company that every time their Laravel, actually it wasn't Laravel, it was another PHP app, but every time their app was hit from a web view, it would contact parameter store secrets manager, pull the secret, set it in the actual code, and then continue to execute. It was painful, and it's not a really good way to architect the secrets. A better example might be to pull the secret once an hour or once a day and store it locally on the instances. And that would cut back on lookups, which what you're charged on when you set up Secrets Manager. CloudFront not optimally configured. I've seen a lot of clients where they will not set up the caching. It's just real simple. And once someone visits your website once and they start caching the page, when they continue to visit, it won't re-download images and things like that if their caching is set up correctly. And CloudWatch. So we talked about CloudWatch being used for your bill. I've seen people go too far and have CloudWatch for lots of different auto-scaling groups and situations. And every time you set up a watch, it does cost some money, and they do add up over time, especially if they're in templates and you don't think about them. You're just rolling out cloud watches without thinking that if you're ever going to use them. A couple more I'll touch on. EC2 instances, the zombie volume, which burned me last month with my account. Servers, they're just sitting there idle, costing you money. Poor class choice, for example, the wrong size instance, or when we were talking about the feed pulling, we switched it to an instance that had faster network connection, which allowed us to double the amount of feeds we could pull again. It's just little things like that. Load balancer, especially when I see it being used with one instance, you can easily just set up your traffic to go straight to that instance, or what I prefer, CloudFront, then straight to the instance. And then Lambda functions. Sometimes they're slow. There's efficiencies that can be done there, or they're way over provisioned. RDS, touching on that one we talked about too. Sometimes they don't need to be in high availability mode. And I'm kind of glad in recent years, Amazon stopped referring to the version of RDS where you only spin up one single as a development version, because you can still set up an RDS, one instance server for something such as a blog that's not doesn't need to be high availability, and still set it up to do daily or even hourly backups in RDS, and that be sufficient for that particular application. And the VPCs, it's very often to see internet gateway interfaces be overused, and they can be very costly. Actually, later you can email me or message me, and I'll give you some tips on some open source application you can run instead of a internet gateway, which will basically be the cost of one T3 micro, and it'll do the same job. Oh, and not enabling compression in your VPC when you're dealing with traffic between instances. That's a no-brainer. You can easily cut the traffic between instances, especially when it's going over different regions, in half just by enabling compression. So let's talk about a little bit about money. And we were talking about it. Where can I get you more money for your startup? And this is what we were kind of leading to before, is the AWS Activate program from Amazon. So if you have a startup and you're bootstrapped like myself, you can go there and sign up. Just provide your EIN. Within a couple days, you'll get $1,000 AWS credit that you can immediately start using. If you're an actual startup that's VC funded, there's a lot more credit available to you, up to 100,000, depending on what it is and your how you apply. So with that, thank you very much. I have a barcode here, which actually we'll put the link here because we're virtual, the URL to my website, and please send me feedback or questions, and I will have the slides on how to find even more savings in different infrastructure online, hopefully by next week, before July 4th. Thank you.
Awesome, Angela. Cool stuff. I just wanted to add real quick, some of these cost saving things too. One, to me, it's kind of fun to find these cost savings, and that's going to fund your, next feature build, right? Like if you're looking for money for that. And then the other thing is you mentioned CloudFront, obviously for cost reasons like you suggested, but it's a better customer experience and it can help your search engine optimization because site speed is very much factored into SERP. So another good reason to do that. Did we have any questions? We've got a couple minutes here. Go ahead and take yourself a mute or comments, anything.
I'll just say right off the bat, thanks for telling us about the credits. I think I saw it. I think it might have been in the description for this event, but I like immediately did it because I hadn't heard of it yet. And then yeah, got like the credits in a couple days. So that was really cool. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you for this.
Awesome. There's a way to after 1 year to get another 1,000, but I don't know the details yet.
Okay.
It's been a while.
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah.
Question: is there a way to get credits for students that kind of like transitioned into like working for like their personal account that is not a startup, like a student that's transitioned into working?
That's a good question. I'm not thinking of any off the top of my head. Obviously, when you create a new account, though, there is free tiers of everything.
Yeah.
But if you really get into it, you can easily blow through that.
Carmi, are you still in school?
No, I'm done schooling. So I what I did was I did a boot camp. That's how I got into AWS. And of course, I blew through my 750 free tier like really quickly. And of course, I love what I'm doing. But I was just asking about for some other colleagues who really didn't know how things worked, and they kept like a very large RDS instance up, and they had like views in the thousands. So yeah, just going forward, I wanted to know if you had like those kind of like, I would say, links, or that is not really startup, basically just for like individuals.
Angela, I'm thinking one, community leaders, right? Like sometimes they give us credits to be able to distribute. So through the keep an eye on the community. And then the other thing is for those of you that might be students, there are things called cloud clubs that is
Cloud
associated
clubs.
with us. And that might be another good resource.
Oh, okay.
Angela?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, the cloud clubs, I think you still need to be a student, but yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there too.
Yeah, for sure. Angela? Angelo too?
Angelo T. Yeah, I have kind of two kind of comments for Femi just because I'm not at like hundreds of thousands of users. So like when I started, this was just in a personal account, but now I have like a business set up. In Ohio, it costs $99 to start an LLC, and it's free to get your EIN from the IRS. So for $99, you could set up the business that you have to then get $1,000 worth of free credits. So 10 to 1, that's a pretty good return. And from a tax perspective, if it's a business expense, you write it off. So you're getting like even more value from that if you're an LLC. So that's like some random business thing, maybe worth it. I know something
Okay.
that's been really valuable for me in kind of making the most of AWS and keeping my bills low is developing locally. So like instead of spinning up an RDS, like you really should know how to run Postgres locally on your laptop, and you should know how to run Flask and Python or like your local, like whatever. And then when you're ready, like really like in my case, what I've done is just really in small little pieces move it into serverless because serverless, AWS, you can spiral real quick if you accidentally put huge files on an S3 or pick the wrong instance type for any of these things. Those are just like two little things that maybe are helpful for someone at
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's it. Actually, that's why I use Node for my serverless. And if you're familiar with Node and Lambda functions, if you use Express with Node, it literally works out of the box in Lambda functions. And actually, one of the things you do is basically set up the default route to just all traffic in your Lambda function, your API gateway, I should say, to your Lambda function. And then you let the Lambda function handle the routes, and it makes it a lot easier to manage. And then on top of that, you can make a separate JavaScript file to run that Express server locally, but it's all there. It works exactly the same as if it was in a Lambda function.
Very cool. Well, thanks, Angela. I really appreciate it. This is definitely one of my favorite sessions we've done so far. Definitely, click the QR code there, reach out to Angelo on LinkedIn. Keep an eye on the community. Someone asked about Cloud Clubs. I linked that there. And if you kind of backtrack through the navigation, there are a lot of groups like this that do virtual events. If you can't get to something in person, there's community days, which are full day programming put on by the community for the community. Summits, especially if you don't have budget to get to reInvent. Summits have gotten so darn huge that they are as big as my first reInvent 7 years ago. Like they're absolutely massive now. So thanks all for your time. This will be up on YouTube, and reach out to Angelo. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Angelo.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
See ya.
Bye.